Story 20 of Stories Weird and Wonderful. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mark Losacco. Stories Weird and Wonderful by J. Muddock. Story 20. The Story of a Hanged Man. My name is Phelim Connor. By parentage, I am Irish, but I was born on August 2nd, 1820, at or near a little town called Troy, in the state of Pennsylvania, America. My parents, who were highly respectable, kept a store in that place, and being naturalized Americans, and as I passed 30 years of my life in the States, never having been out of the country from the day of my birth until I was a little past 30, I suppose I have a right to call myself an American. On January 8th, 1849, I was put upon my trial for murder. The trial took place at Philadelphia. It lasted 4 days, and although I was very ably defended, a verdict of guilty was returned against me, and I was sentenced to death. For a whole year I languished in prison, for in America there are so many legal quibbles that a prisoner under sentence of death can avail himself of, that he may postpone the carrying out of his sentence for a considerable time, even if he does not succeed in setting it aside altogether. In my case, every artifice that the cunning of the legal mind could suggest was resorted to, but without avail, and at last the warrant for my death arrived. Thereupon the scaffold was erected, and on February 4th, 1850, I was taken from my cell to the exterior of the prison walls, and in the presence of an enormous concourse of spectators, I was duly hanged. I am aware that this is a startling statement, and will be received with incredulity. But read what follows, and I will give you such facts and figures that you will no longer doubt. Moreover, the story I have to tell is so strange and startling, and withal so true, that it would be hard to find a parallel to it. I was tried before the Honorable Aaron Osgood, one of the supreme judges of the criminal courts in the state of Pennsylvania, and the well-known author of American Criminal Law, which is the standard work in America at the present day. He is also the author of the more widely known American State Criminal Trials, which is likewise a standard book of reference. The leading lawyer for the prosecution was Salem Isaac Shimmer, Esquire, public prosecutor for the state, and his juniors were Mark Phelps, now a judge of the New York bench, and Henry Walford Lane, subsequently of the state criminal procedure offices at Washington, but since dead. My defending counsel was the Honorable Washington Cleveland, admitted to be one of the most powerful pleaders in America, and he was assisted by Gifford Jefferson, Esquire, who has since become famous by his great work, American Laws and the Men Who Founded Them. Anyone who is at all acquainted with America will know that the trial in which I was the chief actor must have been of no ordinary kind to have brought together such a galaxy of legal talent as is represented by the names I have mentioned. The incidents that led up to the trial had kept the whole country in a state of excitement for months, and the trial itself was one of the most sensational on record. During those 4 memorable days the business of the town almost came to a standstill, and all day long, both inside and out of the courthouse, military guards were posted to keep the excited crowds in order. When the verdict became known, so high did partisan feeling run that a riot broke out, and was not suppressed until blood had been shed. There was a very large following indeed in my favour, and considering that I had been unjustly condemned, they allowed their feelings to get the better of their discretion, with the result I have stated. During the 12 months that I lay in prison, my friends were very active, and they left no stone unturned to try and save me from the hangman, but the government declining to interfere, the law was allowed to take its course. On the morning of my execution, notwithstanding that a heavy snowstorm was raging, and the cold was intense, something like 20,000 people had assembled to witness the last act of legal vengeance. Troops had been drafted into the town to preserve order, and the police and warders of the jail were strengthened by a large addition to their number. The fellow who acted as executioner was a notorious rascal, whose real name was Silas Brunner, but who was known as Chowder Sam. How he came to be so called I don't know. I believe he had been condemned to life imprisonment for murder, but had been released on condition of his undertaking to execute criminals when called upon to do so. I shall have more to say about him presently. With these preliminary remarks, I will now tell the story of the strange events that led up to my condemnation and execution. I have already said that my parents were highly respectable people. They were both natives of the county of Cork. My father was employed as a clerk in a Cork bank, and my mother was the daughter of a farmer at Inishannon, a little village about 10 miles to the south of Cork City. She was remarkable for her beauty, being of the true Southern Irish type, which, as is well known, approximates to the classical Spanish type. She had a mass of blue-black hair, eyes of sloes, and a pink coral complexion, with a figure that left nothing to be desired. My father was a good-looking, well-proportioned man, and the two met through my mother visiting at the house of some friends in Cork. It was a case of love almost at first sight, and in spite of much opposition on the part of her relatives, she married my father 6 months later. A year after that a girl was born and died. Then my parents emigrated to America, and after some little wandering about, they finally settled down at Troy, where I was born. I had 2 sisters of whom I shall speak by and by. One of these sisters was destined to play a prominent part in the great tragedy in which I was the leading actor. My parents, having succeeded to a little money through the death of a near relative, opened a general store in Troy, and did so well that they were enabled to give their children a good education. I was intended for a doctor, and having spent some years at school, I was sent to Boston to study for the medical profession. And now let me refer again to my sisters. The eldest, Mary, was as sweet and gentle as a creature as ever the good God put life into. She had all her mother's beauty, with something of it heightened. She could shake her hair out until it touched the ground, and enveloped her like a veil. She had a magnificent head, delicately poised on a swan-like neck. I do not mean to say that she had actually a neck like a swan, but the expression as a figure of speech suggests its perfectness. She had dark, languid eyes with long silken lashes, and a complexion that one could scarcely overpraise. Allied to this physical beauty was a sweet, trusting nature that won every person with whom she came in contact. Well and accurately indeed might I describe my dear sister in the words of the poet: dark her hair as the winter night, white her neck as the alpine snow, red her cheek as the morning light, bright her glance as the artless roe. My second sister, Nora, took more after my father. She hadn't the same wealth of hair, nor the same brilliancy of complexion as Mary. But had Mary not overshadowed her so, Nora would have been pronounced an exceedingly pretty girl. Nor was she quite so gentle and patient as her sister, but she was a dear little woman, quick, impulsive, warm-hearted, generous to a fault, somewhat self-willed, but withal very lovable, and I doted on them both. We were a very united family, and at one time a happier one could not have been found in the United States. These 2 girls were well brought up for people in our station of life, and they were fitted and qualified to take a good position in the world. Between Mary and me there was a difference in age of 5 years, and between Mary and Nora 2 years, so that I was 7 years Nora's senior. When I went to Boston to pursue my studies, I was a man. I had been what is usually termed a little wild. but whatever follies could be laid to my charge, they were the follies of boyhood only. I went to Boston full of noble resolve and high purpose. I talked of distinguishing myself and of writing my name on the annals of fame. My intentions were good. They were the outcome of youthful enthusiasm, and my aspirations were ennobling. There was one weakness, however, in my composition. I lacked that one essential to steady progress: dogged perseverance. I was somewhat of a romantic turn of mind, and could not reconcile myself to anything that partook of a humdrum existence. I had, in fact, an excitable and enthusiastic temperament, that temperament that enables soldiers, sailors, explorers, and pioneers in all works of adventure to distinguish themselves in trying moments and perform great deeds. I had a passion for books of travel and adventure. The wonder is, therefore, that I was content to remain stationary as long as I did. But our destinies work themselves out with clockwork regularity and mathematical precision, although sometimes it is difficult to believe that that is the case. Though any man who will carefully examine the details of his life will be surprised to find that each act, no matter how trivial, and each deed has been but a link fitting into a perfect chain, and that no link could be taken away without destroying the harmony of the whole. This is a truism that may astonish many, but its soundness cannot be gainsaid. Notwithstanding the restlessness that always seemed working within me, I spent over 3 years in Boston, and made good progress with my studies. In fact, I may state that I was succeeded to some extent in distinguishing myself, for I was possessed of an individuality that would not allow me to be content to remain a mere mechanical nonentity, a human sheep, as it were, that based with the flock. That was a position that would not have satisfied my longings or my restlessness. I made many acquaintances and numerous friends in Boston, but there was only one with whom I became really intimate. The one was Defrid Zadwaski. By nationality he was a Pole, but he had been in the States the greater part of his life. He occupied the important position of professor of languages in the college. In age he was only a few years older than I was. His disposition and temperament approximated pretty closely to my own in 1 or 2 respects. He was restless, for instance, and always seemed to be yearning to constantly change the surroundings of his life. He was ambitious and capable of enthusiasm, but there the parallel ceases. In other respects, he was my antithesis. He was a dreamer for the most part. He was a mystic. His philosophy was tinged with skepticism and morbidness, and he held extraordinary views with regard to the relations of the sexes one to the other. He argued that woman, neither as an actual fact nor as a potentiality, was nor could she become man's equal. That being his inferior both mentally and physically, she was, theoretically at least, man's servant, and that it was her duty to administer to his wants, his pleasures, to afford him gratification, and to anticipate his wishes. That when she ceased to do any of these things, she could, and should, be put away, as any other hired servant might. Now, although this peculiar doctrine was to me heresy as compared with my own way of thought on the subject, I conceived an unaccountable liking for the man. That he was clever goes without saying, for only a clever man is capable of such distinct individuality as he displayed. But it was not exactly in his cleverness, and certainly not in his physical attributes, that his attractiveness lay, for he was somewhat under the medium height, with a sallow complexion and a rather shrunken figure. It was in a peculiar fascination of manner. Of course, it will be argued from this that only weaker-minded men could fall under his sway, and that consequently I was weak-minded. I'm not prepared to admit that that is altogether correct, but it is no part of my purpose to enter into any critical argument on the subject here. Defrid Zadwaski fascinated me as he fascinated hundreds of others. Moreover, the liking seemed to be mutual. He averred that I charmed him, and that there was an originality about me that he liked. The result was we became close companions. It was not until about the year after we had become really intimate that I took him down one vacation to my home. It may seem singular, and I will confess that it was singular, that I, the brother of two young women who were conspicuous for their beauty and no less for their loving and confiding dispositions, should have brought them under the influence of a man who held such remarkable views as to woman's position. But how often do we do things in life which do not strike us as being outré until after, perhaps long after, they are done? He spent a fortnight at our house on that occasion, and before returning to Boston I asked my sisters what they thought of Zadwaski. Nora answered impulsively, "I don't like him," but Mary, more guardedly, and with an obvious reserve, said, "He's a little peculiar, but still he's not objectionable." "Did he tell you," I said laughingly, "that his idea of woman is that she should be an absolute slave to man?" "No," she answered quickly, and changing colour. This change of colour being due to indignation, for Mary had a high opinion of her sex, and her idea was that woman was man's equal in every respect. "Oh, well, you know, Mary," I returned, "men in their youth often say things that are not worth serious consideration. Zadwaski is not a bad fellow, and he is clever." "Yes," she answered, in a strangely thoughtful manner, "he is clever." 6 months later I took Zadwaski down home again, and that time he was 3 weeks with us. We were, as it seemed, perhaps literally so, a happy party, though the most perfect happiness is at times only but a thin veneer, as it were, that hides unending sorrow. Nature oft-time weaves the beauty and the deadly, the attractive and the revolting together. In the most beautiful of tropical forests, where the eye is ravished by grandeur and sublimity, the deadly serpent lurks, and life and death go linked together. When Zadwaski and I were on our way back, I observed that he seemed much more contemplative than usual. He was frequently given to fits of abstraction, but somehow, now, he appeared to be altogether unusually absorbed. "What is sinking into your ponderous brain now, Defrid?" I asked with a laugh. He started like one who starts suddenly from a dozing condition on being shaken, and he answered me ambiguously, apparently, though his answer was the keynote to the solution of his mood. "I've been thinking that my views in regard to woman require modifying." "Oh!" I exclaimed in surprise. "Yes." "Since when did you begin to change your doctrine?" "Since I met your sister Mary." "Indeed," I answered, a little seriously, as a new light dawned upon me. "Am I to understand from that, my friend, that you've fallen in love with Mary?" He did not answer my question immediately. He pondered upon it before he spoke. "You may understand this much. Mary has exercised an influence over me such as no other woman has ever done before." He paused again before asking this question as a correlative to his remark. "Are you glad or sorry to hear that?" "I cannot say at the present moment, but I am either the one or the other," I replied. Perhaps I ought to have guessed that something of this kind was all but inevitable if you and my sister became acquainted. That may be a compliment for you both. But my happiness is so bound up in the happiness of my sisters that I should like to be sure, very sure, that before giving my approval of any engagements, the men who sought them for wives were beyond all question of doubt calculated to enhance their happiness, to respect them as wives, to honour them as women. I saw by the expression of his face that my remark displeased him. There was a point in it, as I intended there should be, and it pricked him a little. He thought, no doubt, that it implied doubt of him. "Well, let us drop the subject for the present," he said, and so we did not discuss it again. For many days after that, however, I was troubled about this matter, and at length I wrote a long letter to Mary asking her to tell me candidly what her feelings were for Zadwaski. Her answer was brief and displeased me. This was about the substance of it. "You ask me a question that at present I am unable to answer. I am not even sure of my own feelings, and moreover, dear brother, I am not disposed to make you my confessor, at all events until there is something more definite to confess." Mary, in writing, thus could have had no possible intention of paining me, but she did pain me nevertheless. Some days later, Zadwaski approached me and said, "Pray, my dear fellow, do not attach any importance to what I said the other day. I was under the impression then that I had a growing love for your sister. I have examined my heart since and find I am mistaken. I shall always regard her with great respect, but I shall carefully avoid seeing her again." I confess to a feeling of some relief as he told me this, for much as I had been charmed with the man, when it came to the possibility of his marrying my sister, I viewed him in a different light. After this, we resumed our old relations, and Mary's name was never mentioned. But I was struck by one thing. Zadwaski seemed to change. He went about like a man who had something preying on his mind, and I was under the impression he shunned me somewhat. The result was there was a gradual and almost imperceptible breaking off of that close intimacy that had existed until at last, without any rupture of any kind or any explanation, we seemed by mutual consent to avoid each other. A few months after this change had come about, it chanced that I was standing in the hall of the college when the morning mail was delivered. I was very anxious to receive letters, as I had had none from home for several days, and the last one had spoken of my mother being slightly indisposed. I therefore eagerly examined the bundle of letters, to see what there was for me, and in doing so I came across one addressed to Zadwaski, and the handwriting was that of my sister Mary. My heart leapt into my mouth, for this letter pointed to a secret correspondence, and my distrust of the Pole had become a very real thing now. I said nothing to Zadwaski. I knew too much of him to suppose that he would give me any information. But as soon as I could get away I went down home and told Mary what my suspicions were. At first she prevaricated, but at last admitted that she had been carrying on a correspondence. I was hurt and distressed, for I saw that the fascination this man had exercised over her must indeed have been great when it could lead her to deceive or even to attempt to deceive her only brother. I went back to Boston full of determination and feeling as if a crisis in my fate had arrived. I sought an interview with Zadwaski and accused him of treachery and deceit. He refused to plead guilty to the accusation, and said he should resolutely decline to consult me as to the course he should pursue in regard to my sister. This defiance and impudence irritated me beyond control, and forgetting myself, I struck him a severe blow. He did not attempt to return it, but he at once brought my conduct under the notice of the authorities, and I was called upon to make a public apology. This I declined to do, and I was told that expulsion would follow if I did not. But I did not wait for them to expel me. I went that very night, and smarting from a sense of unmerited injury and of a wrong done me by my sister, whom I had worshipped, I turned my face westward to those lonely regions where danger and excitement might make a man forget almost that he had lived before. For over 2 years I wandered about those western wilds, and threw myself heart and soul into the adventurous existence peculiar to them. I might fill a big volume with all I went through during that period. I literally carried my life in my hands, but the very excitement begotten by this sort of thing pleased me, and I became oblivious to almost everything else. Then one day an old newspaper came into my hands, and amongst the obituary notices I read of the death of my mother. If an Indian's arrow had suddenly quivered through my body, I could not have experienced a keener pang or a more sickening sense of faintness than I did when I read that announcement. Oh, how I reproached myself for my long silence, and for the way I had left my home. Homesickness came strong upon me at that moment, and I hurried to my native place to find what? Not the peaceful, happy home I had left, but a desolation, a wreck. My father prematurely aged and well nigh distracted, my mother dead, and my sisters gone. "Where are Nora and Mary?" I asked of my father in a choking voice, and feeling as if my heart was literally swelling up and going to burst. I knew something dreadful had happened. It was written in his face, which was wrinkled and haggard. His eyes were sunken, his hair white. My question caused some colour to come into his pale cheeks and fire into his dimmed eyes. "I don't know," he said, as he ground his teeth and clenched his hands. "I don't know," he repeated with greater emphasis, and speaking like a man who was swayed by some mighty passion which he only kept in check by a still mightier effort. I looked at him. His eyes met mine, and in his gaze I read much. Then, before I could recover myself and speak, he broke into sobs, and with a reproach in his tone exclaimed, "Oh, Phelim, why did you leave us as you did? Ours was a happy home before you went away. Now look at it. Your dear mother lies in her grave, and your sisters—" That look of passion came back into his face, and his eyes blazed. "I feel inclined sometimes to curse them," he added, hissing the words out, as it were, fiercely. "Hush," I said, "curse not, but tell me all." "Mary went first," he began, but as he spoke something came up in his throat and seemed to choke him. He made an effort to control himself, then added, "And Nora followed her." The terrible truth flashed upon me now like an inspiration, and I said with unnatural calmness, "And Defrid Zadwaski is responsible for Mary's going away?" "How do you know?" asked my father passionately. "I guess it," I returned. "Yes, he took her away." As my father said this, he was a study of concentrated and yet controlled passion. But had Zadwaski stood there at that moment, it would have been his last. It was terrible to see my father now, gentle, generous, and confiding as he had always been, so utterly changed, to see the fierce passion that was shaking him, and the craving for revenge that blazed forth from his eyes. But the tigress, robbed of her young, is doubly dangerous, and had not my father been robbed of his daughters, upon whom he had doted? When he grew calmer he told me the whole pitiable story. After I went away Zadwaski renewed his visits to our house, until my father took a strong dislike to him, and forbade him to come again. He returned no more, but kept up a secret correspondence with Mary, who suddenly left her home. The shock of her going away in this manner was awful. It shattered my mother's health, and almost deprived my father of reason. But notwithstanding that, Nora disappeared soon after. This last blow crushed my mother into her grave, and turned my father into a lonely, broken-hearted old man, whose one prayer, one thought, one hope was revenge. I listened to this terrible story without sign, without motion, without any outward expression of the passion that was almost tearing me into pieces. But that strange calm which precedes the bursting of the tropical typhoon is not more surely indicative of the coming storm than was that unnatural calm which possessed me as my honoured father told me of my sister's shame and of Zadwaski's perfidy. At such a time as this a man, or at any rate most men, and I was one of them, looks not beyond his human sphere, nor turns his eyes to that mystical hereafter, when, as we are taught, man's wickedness to man shall be divinely judged and divinely punished. He who has no craving for revenge in such an hour of humiliation and shame must have something of the divine element in him. Judged by this, then, I had no such element in me, for in my brain there seemed to ring a voice that cried ceaselessly, "Revenge! Revenge! On the table in the room in which my father had told me the story of shame was the large, old family Bible, from which my beloved mother was in the habit of daily reading to us when we were children. I placed my right hand on the sacred book, and standing erect I raised my left arm at full length, with the index finger pointing to heaven, and still outwardly calm and with wonderful self-possession, I spoke. And this is what I said. I can repeat the sentence word for word with unerring accuracy, for every word burned itself into my brain. Father, here in your presence, with my hand on this Bible and in the sight of heaven, I swear to search the earth, if necessary, to find Defrid Zadwaski, and, when I have found him, to kill him. A cry of fierce joy broke from my father's trembling lips, and tottering to me, he threw his arms round my neck and embraced me, saying the while, "Now, indeed, you are my son. While the destroyer of your sister lives, the earth groans from the presence of a foul monster. Slay him, and every honest man in the world to whom honor is more precious than life will bless you." "And now tell me," I said, "know you where Zadwaski is?" "No." "Then from north to south, from east to west will I wander until I have found him," I answered. An hour later I started on my quest, and I went direct to Boston in order to try and get a clue to the man I was now sworn to hunt down and kill. The return to the scenes of my happy college days affected me deeply, as many golden memories were recalled. But my heart softened not, my purpose never wavered. The voice in my brain still rang out, "Revenge! Revenge!" I learned in Boston that the last known of Zadwaski was that he was resident in New York as a teacher of languages. That night I was on my way to New York. I had no difficulty in finding Zadwaski's address, as it was in the directory. I accordingly made my way to 104th Street, at the top of the 5th Avenue and near Central Park. But on arriving there it was only to find that he whom I sought had gone away 6 months before, without leaving any address. He had occupied rooms in a flat, and the proprietor of this flat was a man. To him I addressed myself, asking many particulars of his erstwhile lodger, and from the landlord's lips I learned the following particulars, which I give in his own words. He had 2 ladies with him when he came here. One he represented as his wife, and the other as his wife's sister. But I found out afterwards that one was just as much his wife as the other. In short, he was not married to either, but he treated them both, poor things, as if they had been his slaves. There is a common expression, "my blood boils," used to convey some indication of unutterable indignation and anger at wrong or insult done to one. It is a figure of speech, of course, but there are times when outrage to one's feelings is so great that it literally seems as if the blood bubbled up in the veins. Such a feeling as this did I experience as I listened to the landlord's words. And yet outwardly I was calm, but mentally I repeated the oath I had taken in my father's house, and the dumb voice in my brain cried with accentuated emphasis, "Revenge!" But all the story was not yet told, and dreaming not that I was the brother sworn to avenge the wrongs done to his sisters by shedding the blood of the wretch who had destroyed them, the landlord gave me a sequel. The younger of the 2 ladies, Nora she was called, seemed always to be in a state of great despondency, and she suffered greatly from hysterical outbursts. In that state she used to curse Zadwaski and call constantly for Phelim. Who Phelim was or is I don't know, for the 3 of them were very reticent, and never spoke of their connections. "Phelim," I answered quietly, "is the name of Nora's brother, and should he and Zadwaski ever meet, Zadwaski's life will not be worth a minute's purchase." "Ah!" exclaimed the landlord in a gratified way. "He deserves killing, for 2 more charming girls I never knew, and yet he treated them shamefully. Poor Nora got so bad at last that she was removed to the 5th Ward Lunatic Asylum." This statement caused me for the first time to betray my feelings. It was as if he had struck me a violent blow, causing me to stagger. He looked somewhat surprised and asked, "Are you any relation?" "Yes," said I, "her brother Phelim." "Good God!" exclaimed the landlord. "Is it possible?" I was calm again as I answered, "Yes, I am her brother, and I have sworn on the Bible to kill Zadwaski." The landlord grasped my hand and wrung it. He was much moved. "The villain deserves it," he said. "But the taking of life, even the life of one who has wronged you, is by the law of our country murder, and the punishment for murder is an ignominious death." I smiled contemptuously, but I know that I had the landlord's sympathy, for he wrung my hand again. Then we parted, and I at once made my way to the 5th Ward Lunatic Asylum. I was told that Nora Connor, the name she was known by there, was a hopeless lunatic, that her mind was quite shattered. Not without great difficulty did I obtain permission to see her. How can I describe my feelings as I was ushered into her presence, and saw before me a haggard, pale old young woman? The eyes vacant and staring, the face puckered with an imbecile grin, the head clean-shaven and covered with a closely fitting skull cap. All day long, I was told, she paced up and down the room to which she was confined, muttering to herself and occasionally crying out, "Phelim, Phelim, Phelim." If ever man's heart bled, as the saying is, mine did. Her mind was such a blank that she utterly failed to recognize me, and as I went away I said to myself, "May Heaven trebly curse me if I let Zadwaski live." I ascertained at the asylum that for a short time after Nora had been taken there, a lady, her sister, called occasionally to see her. But these visits ceased, though for a little while a sum of money was sent regularly to enable Nora to be supplied with extra comforts. But the remittances suddenly stopped also. "From what part of the country did the remittances come?" I asked. "From Philadelphia," was the answer. 4 hours later I was on my way to Philadelphia. On arrival there I immediately consulted a directory, but searched in vain for Zadwaski's name. There was an agency, however, for teachers of languages in the town, and thither I went as a sort of forlorn hope. But fate served me, and I found that the agency had the villain's name on their books. He was staying in Philadelphia, and his address was given to me. At last, then, I had run him to earth, and his hours were numbered. But I did not rush off there and then to slay him. Such impulse would not have accorded with my temperament. I must kill this man slowly and deliberately, so that in his dying moments there should be compressed some of the agony that he had inflicted on me and mine. My first step was to ascertain something of his habits, and if my sister Mary was with him. I soon found out that she was not. She was elsewhere. That elsewhere was an obscure grave, marked only with a number in the cemetery. That number corresponded with a number in the books of the cemetery, and against the number was written, "Mary Connor, native of the United States, date of birth unknown, supposed to be between 25 and 30 years of age at time of death, class of grave H2 in Roman Catholic portion of cemetery." This class of grave, as I was informed, was the very poorest class, and in that part of the cemetery no stones were allowed to be placed over the dead. Here were gathered the waifs and strays, the unknown dead, the suicides and the like, and in this spot lay the remains of my once beautiful sister. To that humble grave I went in the gloaming of the sombre October day. In the low, blurred sky was no gleam of light. From the trees the withered leaves were falling, and over those nameless mounds the wind wailed and sobbed. Kneeling down, I renewed my oath, and then, falling across the grave, I wept tears of phosphorus, or some other scalding matter, for I had no ordinary tears to shed. And in that supreme moment of agony my heart broke in twain. I arose and turned away. The night had come, even as the night of my life had come. The world was naught to me now. It contained only two persons as far as I was concerned. The one myself, the other Zadwaski, and when I had killed him I should be a lonely man in a lonely world. This man lodged in a respectable house. He occupied 2 rooms, and his habit was to go every evening to a well-known saloon where he sat playing chess, a game of which he was inordinately fond, until a late hour. To that saloon I repaired, and then, for the first time since I last saw him in Boston, I gazed upon his accursed features, and a fierce, mad joy filled me. He had altered greatly. There were traces of dissipation on his face, and a restless, pained expression in the eyes that looked like remorse. Was it remorse? Could such a monster, who had wrecked a happy home and destroyed 2 dear women, feel remorse? No, I was wrong. It was not remorse. It was fear. For 3 long hours I sat in a corner and watched him, and I thrilled with a sense of exquisite joy that at last my quest was ended, and that never again would I lose sight of him until his black and rotten heart had ceased to beat. Midnight struck from the town clock, and a few minutes later he rose to go. I rose too. He was in the shadow of death, but he did not know it then. He shook hands with his companions, and he laughed, but it was not the laugh of a man who was happy. Then he lit a cigar and went out into the dark night and towards his grave. Rain was falling. A bitter wind was sweeping through the deserted streets, and pulling his coat about his throat and battering his hat down upon his head, he hurried along. And I followed noiselessly, as if my feet had been shod in wool. Up the many flights of steps that led to his lodgings he went, and I was within a few yards of him. He opened the door of his house with a latch key. I had, by a subterfuge, previously provided myself with a key, and 10 minutes after he had entered, I softly opened the door, closing it as softly after me. Then I crept to his room. He had thrown off his coat, wrapped himself in a rug, and was finishing his cigar. As I entered, I turned the key in the door, and the noise caused him to glance round, and seeing a stranger in his apartment, he sprang up and exclaimed, "What is the meaning of this? Who are you?" "I am Phelim Connor," I answered slowly and solemnly. He staggered back, his face turned ashen. The half-burnt cigar fell from his blanched lips, and a look of mortal fear came into his eyes. "What do you want here?" he gasped out hoarsely. "I have come to kill you," I answered. A look of unutterable, absolutely indescribable terror swept over his ghastly face. He cast a nervous glance at the door of his bedroom, but between it and him I stood. No doubt in his room he had some weapon, but he could only reach it over my dead body, and in my hand, which was firm as a rock, I held a revolver. "You wouldn't kill me in cold blood," he whined. I laughed a mocking laugh of derision. "You wrecked my home in cold blood," I hissed. "You sent my mother to her grave in cold blood. You drove one of my sisters mad in cold blood, and in cold blood you broke the heart of the other and cast her body into a pauper's grave. A man, when he sees a snake crawling at his feet, crushes it in cold blood. To my mind you are infinitely more loathsome and more horrible than the most deadly of reptiles, and I shall slay you in cold blood, as you call it. That is, I shall kill you without the slightest compunction." "God pity me," he moaned. "No," I replied, "God will not pity you. You are accursed, even of heaven." In the madness of his despair he seized a chair to hurl at me, but, With never a nerve of my body quivering, I fired, purposely striking him in the shoulder, just below the neck. He reeled and fell against the table, and the sight of his blood pouring out filled me with savage delight. "Pity!" he gurgled. "Yes," I returned, "the pity you accorded to my dear sisters." Again I fired, shattering his right arm, and he sank to the floor with a groan. He was not dead, not even insensible, but I had a conviction that his life was fast ebbing away, and so I did not fire again, but kneeling down I put my lips to his ear and hissed, "I curse you, Defrid Zadwaski. Die with all your heavy sins upon your soul." By this time the household was aroused. There were the shrill screams of women, the cries of men who were thundering at the door. I turned the key, and flinging the door open, confronted the clamouring and affrighted people. "There lies a human reptile," I said, "and I have in cold blood, and deliberately out of malice aforethought, killed him. Here is my weapon, and all I ask is that you will let me witness his dying agony." My revolver was taken, and I was seized by men, but I wrenched myself free and stepped back to where Zadwaski was lying. He turned his dying eyes upon me. Then I saw them glaze. I heard a gurgle in his throat, saw his breast flutter, and knew then that he was dead. I confronted the people and said, "My revenge is satisfied as far as it can be on earth, and now you can do as you like with me." There is no purpose to serve in dwelling upon all the details of my arrest, my lodgment in prison, the weary waiting for the trial, and the trial itself to which I have alluded. At first a public cry of rage went up against me. Zadwaski was supposed to have been highly respectable. He was spoken of as a quiet, inoffensive gentleman, and the press said my crime, if crime it was deliberate, brutal, and fiendish. Gradually, however, some of the particulars of the story of shame and wrong began to leak out, and it was found that the saint-like Pole had been a devil in disguise. My friends, and I'm happy to say I had many, took my case up very warmly, and one of the most ardent defenders of my act of vengeance was Dr. Silas King. This gentleman was for some years on the surgical staff of the New York Infirmary, but had been settled in Troy for a long time, and had been our family doctor. He knew my dear sisters intimately, and had once asked Mary to become his wife. He was a widower with 2 children, and as there was considerable disparity of age between him and Mary, my people opposed the marriage, although they much admired Dr. King. He said that if he did not get Mary, he would never marry again, and he kept his word. Now, when he learned the dreadful fate of my sisters, he threw himself heart and soul into my defence. He was an eloquent speaker and a good writer, and he both wrote and spoke in my defence, sparing no time, trouble, or expense. He gave Zadwaski's history to the world, and showed what a black-hearted villain he was, and how shamefully he had treated my sisters, driving one to madness and the other to an untimely grave. But Zadwaski also had powerful friends amongst his compatriots, and so there were 2 strong parties formed. I have already spoken of the great array of legal talent that was gathered on both sides during my trial, but in spite of all that was done for me, the verdict was adverse, and I was sentenced to die. The verdict was received with great disfavour by my supporters, and, losing control of themselves, they came into collision with Zadwaski's partisans, and there was much fighting and bloodshed. When my poor old father heard of the verdict, he was seized with a fit of apoplexy, from which it was thought he could not rally. He did, however, subsequently recover, but he was a wreck physically and mentally. During the terrible year following my trial and the execution of my sentence, Dr. King never once relaxed his exertions. I had no fear of death myself. I had no clinging to life, but I did shrink from the ignominy and shame of a public execution. when at last it was found that all the appeals that had been made in my favour were rejected, and the law was to take its course, Dr. King visited me. He was burning with rage and indignation, and he told me that he would save my life yet, and he proposed a plan to that end. During subsequent interviews he unfolded this plan to me, and by means of considerable bribes of money which my father found, for he was well off, Dr. King secured the cooperation of 2 of the warders, the sub-governor of the prison, and of Chowder Sam, the executioner, who would have sold his own mother for a few dollars. Without Chowder Sam's assistance, Dr. King's daring scheme could not have been carried out. In virtue of a solemn oath I took to Dr. King never to reveal the precise means he resorted to in order that I might be saved from the effect of the hangman's rope, I cannot disclose his plan. The object he aimed at was to prevent suffocation, and a singularly ingenious arrangement was adopted by the executioner, acting under Dr. King's instructions, whereby too great pressure on the neck was prevented. I must mention that execution at this time in the United States was by sheer strangulation, not by a drop, and therefore Dr. King's plan was calculated to produce the desired effect. Had the drop been in force, the plan would have been useless. On the morning of my execution, the weather was in my favour, for it was snowing heavily, and though it did not prevent the people from assembling in enormous numbers, it did prevent them seeing the scaffold clearly, and Chowder Sam was enabled to do his part of the work without attracting attention. All being ready, I was strung up, and though the pressure of the rope was but slight, it was sufficient to produce insensibility. At first I suffered pain. Then there stole upon me a delightful sense of dreamy languor, and all that had been most joyous and beautiful in my life passed before me as in a vision. And then I saw my sister Mary, her dear face wearing a smile of ineffable sweetness, and her shoulders invested with great white pinions. After that came a blank, and what followed I subsequently learned from Dr. King. As soon as I was cut down he claimed my body, and had brought a shell secretly ventilated. Into this my body was put, and then Dr. King had the coffin placed on a vehicle he had provided, and with all speed he conveyed my supposed corpse to his house. There he at once began means to bring about my resuscitation, and in the course of half an hour his efforts were successful. For some time after recovering consciousness I suffered much pain. I could not bear the light in my eyes, and I seemed so morbidly sensitive to sound that the slightest noise almost drove me mad. In the course of a few days, however, these symptoms wore off, and I gradually returned to my normal condition. Then I was secretly conveyed to Canada, where in a little while my father joined me, and I remained there until his death 4 years later, and after that I came to England, where I have resided ever since. I am a lonely old man now. My dear friend, Dr. King, and poor Nora have long been dead, and many another who made my wrecked life worth clinging to has likewise passed away, so that the world is to me now a blank. The end cannot be far off, and I am impatient for its coming. Death, whenever he comes, will come to me as a friend. It has been said that we make our own fate. He who reads this startling but true record can form his own opinion whether I made mine, or it was thrust upon me. End of Story 20. Recording by Mark Losacco.
Story 21 of Stories Weird and Wonderful. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sam Munson. Stories Weird and Wonderful by J.E. Muddock. Story 21. The Crime of the Rue Aubert. Enthusiasts have spoken of Paris as one of the most beautiful cities in the world. The Parisians themselves go farther than this and say it is the most beautiful city. The Parisians may be forgiven for their pride, for if we confine ourselves to the Paris of the boulevards, it is beautiful. But there is another Paris which the ordinary traveler does not see. It is a Paris of hideousness, of squalor, of all that is hateful and revolting in human nature. This gay capital, in fact, is a city of the most extraordinary and striking contrasts. And there is another aspect, too, which the observant writer cannot overlook. It is the city of original crimes. It has been reserved for Paris to exhibit human nature in such hideous and cruel forms that one shudders and bows his head in shame and sorrow as he thinks of it. Of course, other cities have their plague spots and human fiends, but it is to Paris the world looks for novelty in the way of crime. But perhaps one of the most mysterious and novel crimes that even Paris has placed upon the records is that which has come to be known as the crime of the Rue Aubert. The Rue Aubert, let it be understood, is not one of the slums of the city. It is not situated in the plague spots of Clichy and Saint-Ouen. It has no connection with the notorious west of the Grand Opera, and forming part of a line of connection between the Boulevard des Italiens and the magnificent Boulevard Haussmann, which runs north. The houses in the Rue Aubert are marked by a monotonous regularity of architecture. They are all large apartment houses, and rise to a height of 5 stories, each story or flat representing 2 households. At number 13 in this street, according to superstitious people, 13 is always an unlucky number, and on the 3rd etage or flat lived Monsieur Henri Didet and his wife, together with one servant, Eugenia Suchard, a woman of about 50 years of age. Didet was a young man, a little over 30, and he was remarkable for his handsome appearance. He was the average height for a Frenchman, with a grace of carriage and perfection of figure. He had a mass of dark hair that fell over his white forehead in a wealth of tiny ringlets. His face was clean-shaven, except for his dainty moustache, which he always scrupulously trimmed. His peculiarly mobile face seemed capable of almost any change, and his eyes, which were dark and piercing, appeared to possess the faculty of looking right through you. In disposition he was insincere, incapable of anything like serious thought, and he abandoned himself to the whirl and gaiety of Parisian life. It might be said that he passed his time in planning pleasure for the morrow and in thoroughly enjoying himself the day before. He was a Parisian of Parisians, and life for him had no higher meaning than to live, and his interpretation of to live was gaiety of every possible kind, an hourly and daily ministration to the carnal pleasures. He had for some time been in business as a chemist, though his want of seriousness prevented him from succeeding. That, however, did not matter. His handsome person won him a lady who brought him a large dot, and just after his marriage an aunt died and left him a small fortune, so he sold the chemist's business, and retired to lead the only kind of existence that charmed him. Madame Didet was a petite woman, not bad-looking, but somewhat insipid. She was fair with blue eyes, and rather wanting in expression. She was delicate, with a fragile form, and a dreamy eye, and a general languid appearance. Although she did not suffer from any actual illness, she was subject to attacks of hysteria. She was devoted to her husband, but exceedingly jealous of him, not, however, without good cause. He seemed to possess remarkable influence over her, an influence due to a certain magnetic power he exercised, and by which he was enabled to bend her to his will in almost every conceivable way. It is necessary to say that Eugenia Suchard, their servant, was rather a stupid kind of woman, but she had been with Didet long before he was married, and she was much attached to her master and mistress. When the Didets first went to live at 13 Rue Aubert, the other half of the flat upon which they had their residence was not occupied. It had been without tenant for some months, as people complained that the rent was too high. But soon after the Didets went there, the other half of the flat was taken by a Monsieur Chaucot, who had been an officer in the army, but had been compelled to retire owing to a wound he received, which unfitted him for military service. He was married, and between him and his wife was considerable disparity of age. He was about 50, while she was not more than 30, and was remarkably handsome. He was a reserved man, somewhat retiring in disposition, while she was volatile and fond of gaiety. Between these two families, being close neighbors as they were, an intimacy soon sprang up. But it was not long before it became evident to Madame Didet that her husband was paying more attention to the pretty Madame Charcot than was consistent with mere neighborly feeling. This led to some unpleasantness between Didet and his wife, but he assured her, vowed solemnly in fact, that is, as solemnly as such a man could vow, that she was mistaken. She was satisfied, and things went on harmoniously again for some time. But during this time Didet was falling desperately in love with his pretty neighbor, and she did not seem to object. One day a picnic had been arranged between the two families, and Charcot and Didet, accompanied by their wives and another lady and gentleman, went out for the day. It was summertime, and they took the train to Saint-Germain. This is a favorite resort of the Parisians in summer. It is a charming spot, a little paradise. There is a magnificent forest, many miles in extent, with romantic glades and entrancing walks, and there is a celebrated hotel, the Hôtel de Louis XIV. It stands in extensive grounds on a terrace that commands a magnificent panorama of the valley of the Seine, with the tortuous river threading its way with many folds and twists, like a silver serpent. Here in the grounds of this hotel are numerous bowers under trees, and it is delightful to sit there on a summer day, the air languid with the scent of flowers and musical with birdsong, and partake of the exquisite dinner for which the hotel is famed. The little party enjoyed themselves, with all the abandon peculiar to the Parisian when out for the day. A recherche dinner was taken part of, and several bottles of choice wine were discussed, and over the cigars and coffee there was much laughter and joking. The French people are a light-hearted people. They live in the today. The tomorrow is but a dream, a vague shadow to them. Madame Didet was particularly vivacious. The wine had heightened her color and brightened her eyes, and as she toyed with a dainty cigarette, her laughter was silvery and light, as though she had not a care in the whole world. The day was deepening to its close. Already the purple shadows were creeping along the valley, and the river was growing tawny in the fading light. Beneath a group of trees at the end of the terrace in the hotel garden, a man and woman stood, all but hidden by the darkness caused by the trees. The man was Didet, the woman, Madame Charcot. They had stolen away from the others, she first, he following some time after. He held her hand, though she was trying to disengage it, and into her ear he was whispering in impassioned language these words. "Agathe," he called her by her Christian name. "Agathe, why did fate not bring us together 2 years ago?" "Ah," she sighed. "Agathe," he cried, growing more excited as her sigh told him that his words found an echo in her own breast. "Agathe, je t'aime." She started at this declaration, and in accents that told of her distress, she said, "No, no, Monsieur Didet, you must not talk to me like that. Remember my husband." "Mon Dieu," hissed Didet fiercely under his breath. "I always remember him. Which devil was it that gave you a husband and me a wife before you and I met?" "Hush, hush," she said appealingly. "We must be satisfied with our lot. We must not talk of love." "Agathe," he murmured in stricken tones, "have you no love for me?" She averted her face from him and whispered, "I might have had." "You might have had?" "Yes." "But why have you not now?" "Because I am already a wife," she sighed. He threw his arms round her and drew her to his breast, but at that moment a man sprang forward, and seizing her arm, he twisted her around, almost flinging her to the ground, and then with blazing eyes and a white face he confronted Didet. The newcomer was Charcot, and in a voice hoarse with passion he exclaimed, "I suspected this. You are a snake, and your very breath is poison. But beware how you tamper with my wife, lest I am tempted to kill her and you." Didet had nothing to say. He did attempt to stammer forth something in the nature of an excuse, but he knew his guilt, and the words stuck in his throat. It was hardly possible that this scene could be kept from Madame Didet. She saw by her husband's face that something had happened, and guessed what that something was. And when Charcot took his wife away and went back to Paris without the rest of the party, she knew that her guess was right. Then ensued a pitiable scene. She went into violent hysterics, and rent the air with her screams, and so unmanageable did she become, and so excited, that her husband decided not to return to Paris that night, but to remain with her at the hotel. All night long she raved, but towards the morning sank to sleep, waking up 3 hours later prostrated and ill. Her husband went on his knees before her, and vowed that he was deeply repentant, and would never sin in the same way again. She sealed her forgiveness with kisses, and in the afternoon they returned to Paris perfectly reconciled. And when he returned home he sought out Monsieur Charcot, and craved his pardon too, and so earnest did he seem, so humble was he shed so many tears, and made so many protestations, that Charcot, who was not a vindictive man, was moved, and said he would think no more of the matter. Thus the neighborly relations were resumed, although the little episode had undoubtedly left some frigidity behind it. If the serpent had not been in the Garden of Eden, Eve would not have fallen, and had Charcot taken his wife away, Didet might not have been tempted. But for weeks and months after that affair at Saint-Germain, he saw her and seeing sighed, and possibly, nay, probably, something in her face, some look in her eyes, answered him. It was a winter night. Snow was falling over Paris, but nevertheless Monsieur Charcot and his wife had gone to the theatre and taken Madame Didet with them. Didet himself would not go. He pleaded a splitting headache and general malaise. His wife wished to remain and nurse him, but he would not hear of it. He said that he desired to be alone, to be perfectly quiet for a few hours, and insisted on her going. An hour later he gave his servant a couple of francs, telling her that she could invite Charcot's servant to a petit souper at a neighboring café, and when they had gone, he sprang from the couch on which he had been reclining with a towel round his head. He dashed the towel to the ground. His malaise seemed to have flown. He went on to the landing and listened. No one was coming up the stairs, or down from the other flats. All was silent as death, save for a gas jet on the next landing that hissed like an angry snake in the cold blasts of air that rushed up the stairway. Didet took a latchkey from his pocket, and noiselessly opened Charcot's door. Then, with a pair of pincers and a screwdriver, he so altered the position of the check that held the latch when it was let down as to make it useless. The consequence of this was that anyone letting the latch down would not be aware that the check was damaged, and of course would imagine the door was fastened, whereas it could still be opened with a latch key from the outside. Didet's object in doing this we shall presently see. His work completed, he went back to his own house and smoked heavily and drank some cognac. But at 1 o'clock, when his wife returned, he was asleep on the couch. She was tender and loving to him, and told him all about the play, and how she and the Charcots had supped at a café, partaking of oysters and bouillon, and côtelettes à la tomates, and pudding au riz avec sauce à la rhum, followed by Gruyère and some petits fruits. And for wine there had been a bottle of Grave, and a bottle and a half of Chateau Margaux, for Monsieur Charcot, when he went to the theatre, liked to sup well, and he was a connoisseur in wines. And then, as a finale, there had been café noir and a petit verre. "Ah, mon mari," she exclaimed, as she threw her arms round his neck. "The supper was splendid, but mon cher, mon prince, I was so lonely without thee." He laughed and kissed her, but it was a Judas kiss. So Judas kissed his master. Then they went to bed, and through the snowy air the bells of Paris were booming too. Silence. Through the snowy air the bells of Paris were booming 3. Monsieur Didet rose from his bed and arrayed himself in a thick woolen dressing-gown. A shaded lamp was burning low, but gave sufficient light to render objects in the room visible. He bent over his wife. She was sleeping soundly. The petit souper had not disagreed with her. He passed his hand over her head, first from back to front, and then from side to side. She moved, she half turned, she sighed deeply. But he made other passes, and she became passive. Presently he stood erect and waved his hand up and down slowly. Then she rose. Her eyes were open but fixed. Her face was pale. Her lips moved as if in speech, but no sounds issued. "Get up," said her husband softly. She slipped from the bed with no apparent effort and stood before him motionless, her white robe de nuit falling about her like the drapery of a statue. He opened a drawer in the dressing-table and took out something. It was a weapon. He threw off a leather case and revealed a long, sharp, and glittering stiletto. He grasped her hand and then bent her white fingers round the handle of the deadly weapon. He next placed a small phial with a glass stopper in her other hand. That done, he whispered something in her ear, and she began to move towards the door. Through the snowy air the bells of Paris were booming 3:30. He preceded her, opened the door, and she passed out. A little shudder seemed to shake her as her bare feet came in contact with the cold stones. He crept across the landing, and with the latch-key opened Charcot's door. Then, waving his hand, he motioned her to enter. A dim light burned in the passage, and Madame Didet looked like a ghost. All was silent in Charcot's house. The woman moved without a sound, going first now. Didet crept after her on tiptoe. She reached Monsieur Charcot's bedroom. A lamp burned low there also. Charcot slept soundly in one bed, his wife in another. Madame Didet bent over Charcot for a moment or two, then raised her arm high and plunged the long stiletto into his breast. The blood spurted from the wound and encrimsoned Madame Didet's nightdress. The petit souper had caused Madame Charcot to sleep soundly, and she was all unconscious of what was going on. Again, Didet waved his hand, and his wife drew the stopper from the bottle she held. Then she placed the mouth of the phial to her lips. It was filled with a white, colorless fluid, and she poured this fluid down her throat. That act completed, Didet slipped away, leaving Charcot's door open, and his own open, but in his excitement he saw not a figure that cowered against the wall in the passage. He gained his room and threw himself on his bed. Through the snowy air the bells of Paris boomed 4. Didet rolled himself in the blankets and fell asleep. It is astonishing how some men can sleep under every and any circumstances. Through the air, it had ceased to snow. The bells of Paris boomed 7. A little later the laitier, milkman, came up the stairs with the morning milk. On reaching the Didet-Charcot landing, he was surprised to find the doors of both houses open. It was so unusual for them to be open at that time of the morning. He stood at Charcot's door and called the servant, who had only just got out of bed. She could not account for the doors being opened. Moreover, in her master's door was a latchkey. What did this mean? In alarm she went to her master's room, and soon she uttered a cry of terror, for she saw a woman lying on the floor, and thought it was her mistress. The laitier went in and turned up the lamp. Then it was seen that Madame Charcot was in bed and awake. The cry had awakened her, while the nightdress of the woman on the floor was stained with blood. The man drew the curtains of Charcot's bed, then staggered back appalled, for the clothes were all red with blood. A long dagger was sticking in Charcot's breast, and he was dead. With a scream of awful fear, Madame Charcot now sprang up. She recognized the woman on the floor as Madame Didet. She was dead, and in her cold, marble-like hands she tightly grasped a phial. The milkman rushed over to the Didet's house. Eugenia Suchard was already at the door. She looked like a corpse, so ghastly white was she. "Mon Dieu, it's awful, awful," groaned the man. "Where's Monsieur?" "Sleeping soundly in his bed," answered Eugenia with considerable firmness. "There has been murder," said the laitier. "Mon Dieu, it's awful, awful." Then he clattered down the stairs to spread the alarm. In wild terror, Madame Charcot rushed into Didet's house and threw herself onto the floor. He came to her and tried to soothe her. Presently the gendarmes arrived, and over the neighborhood flew the news, and crowds collected, and the most wild and wonderful rumors were circulated. The tragedy was surrounded with mystery, but so far as the investigation of the police went, they were enabled to report that Madame Didet seemed to have stolen from her husband's bedroom, to have entered Charcot's house by means of a duplicate key, had then stabbed him to the heart, and had poisoned herself at his bedside. The motive? Well, it could only be guessed at, but no doubt there had been some guilty liaison between the pair. Possibly, so it was suggested, he wanted to throw her off, and she had resolved to kill him and herself. It was by no means an unfamiliar story in Paris. So in a few days the gay Parisians shrugged their shoulders and said, "These things will happen. How sorry we are for poor Madame Charcot and poor Monsieur Didet. Mon Dieu, it is terrible." And so, with this sympathy, they dismissed the subject, and went on with their gaiety again. In a few weeks Monsieur Didet gave up his house in the Rue Aubert, for he said he could not live in it. The associations were too terrible. The Veuve Charcot also changed her residence, and went to live in the same neighborhood, in fact in the next block of buildings. 4 months later Monsieur Didet announced that he was going to marry the pretty Veuve Charcot. Then his servant Eugenia Suchard, whom he had retained, said, "No, monsieur, you will not marry that woman." Didet thought that his poor servant girl had gone a little cracked, and laughed heartily, but with terrible emphasis Eugenia repeated, "No, monsieur, you will not marry that woman." "Why?" asked her master, growing serious. "Because I forbid it." "You?" "Yes." Didet was ashen now. Something in Eugenia's manner caused his blood to chill. "What do you mean?" he gasped. "I mean what I say. I have held my peace all too long. I loved my mistress, and I have loved you, but I will not see this last outrage committed." "You are mad," he said, as his courage came back, for he mistook her words. "Madame Veuve Charcot and I will assuredly become man and wife." "No," said the woman sternly, "for I'll denounce you first." Once more Didet's face assumed an ashen hue. "On that fearful night I saw all," she added. "I had supped with the Charcot's servant. I had drunk some bad wine, and it gave me cramps so that I could not sleep. I heard you open the door and was alarmed. Coming to see what was the matter, I saw you and Madame go out. She was in her nightdress and asleep. You had mesmerized her. I followed you like a shadow, and saw Madame plunge the knife into Monsieur Charcot's body. Then I fled in horror. Didet was almost paralyzed with surprise and fear. He thought that no human eye had witnessed the deed, and that no human soul had even deemed it possible that he had done this dreadful thing. Here was a revelation. He had committed a fearful crime in order to gain the woman to whom he had given his guilty love. When he had somewhat recovered himself, his first impulse was to kill the sole witness of his guilt, and he endeavored to seize her, but she escaped and ran screaming into the street. He knew then that he was a doomed man, and in the madness of despair and fear he shot himself. And thus Nemesis revenged the dark crime of the Rue Aubert, and the gay Parisians, when they heard of the sequel to the Rue Aubert crime, shrugged their shoulders and talked of it for an hour or two. Then they said, "Ah, these things will happen," and so they went on with their gaiety again. End of Story 21. The Crime of Rue Aubert. Recording by Sam Munson.
Story 22 of Stories Weird and Wonderful. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by phone. Stories Weird and Wonderful by J. E. Muddock. Story 22. The Strange Story of Dr. Martin. Dr. Martin was an extraordinary man in almost every sense in which that word can be applied. He was below the medium height, standing not more than 5 feet 4½ He had a narrow chest, with sloping shoulders somewhat like a woman. He was thin, almost to emaciation, and his clothes hung about him in a loose, ill-fitting way. A stranger seeing him for the first time was moved to pity, thinking the man must be suffering from some obscure, wasting disease, and that his days were numbered. But this feeling wore off on a closer acquaintance, for the doctor was not only remarkably active, but endowed with a vigour of constitution and a power of endurance that might have begot the envy of men of far more robust build. As a matter of fact, the doctor had never had a day's illness in his life worth speaking of, and at the time the event occurred which I shall now relate he was verging on 60. However unattractive his body was, no one could look upon his face without feeling, in a sense, fascinated. His complexion was sallow, his cheeks hollow, but every feature was as delicate and clearly cut as those of a classical statue. The quivering lips, beautifully chiselled, were expressive of intellectual subtlety, but it was in the high, white, massive forehead that the intellectuality was displayed, as well as in the deep-set, almost unnaturally brilliant and restless dark eyes. His face in all its workings revealed the innate force of character and strong individuality of the man. When stirred by inward emotion or passion, his face was a marvellous study. Then his eyes seemed to blaze, and every muscle and line twitched with the tremendous nerve energy that was aroused. In repose, his face had somewhat of a dreamy expression, but once let it thrill with animation, and the contrast was striking, if not startling. His voice was rich and full of volume, and when heard for the first time the listener was astounded at so melodious a voice being associated with so meagre a man. Martin was a native of Cork, but had been educated in Dublin, and was an M.D. and M.A. of Trinity College of that city. At an early age he displayed remarkable precocity, which did not, as is usually the case with precocious children, develop into dullness at a later period. Obtaining his degree when quite a young man, he removed to London, and his force of character and natural cleverness soon won a practice for him. At 32 or 3 he married an Irish lady who was an exceedingly commonplace woman. Good-looking enough and not without intelligence, but still she belonged to a very ordinary type, though she adored her husband and looked upon him as something almost more than mortal. A year after the marriage a daughter came to bless the union, and surely man never idolized a child as Martin idolized this one. But before she had reached the age of 7 she was carried off suddenly by croup, and for a time the blow seemed to crush her father. She was the only child, and on her the parents seemed to have centered all their hopes. So much did the child's death prey upon the mother's mind that she felt seriously and dangerously ill, and her life was threatened. The prospect of this fresh loss aroused the doctor from his stupor, and the old energy came back, though he appeared somehow to be a changed man. He began to preach the doctrine that, save by accident, no human being should die young, and he declared that within reach of the chemist's art was an elixir of life, and he vowed that he would devote all his energies and study to discovering it. But his first attention was given to his sick wife, to whom he was no less devotedly attached than she was to him. With untiring watchfulness he tended her, and it might be said that he ransacked his laboratory for an antidote to her disease. And though he was not able to cry "Eureka!" and say he had found the precise elixir he sought, he nevertheless succeeded in baffling her illness, and she slowly recovered. This stimulated him to renewed research, and though for a time he did not relax his attention to his general practice, he ultimately became so absorbed in his idea that he grew into a monomaniac, and so forgetful of everything else that he neglected his patients and gradually lost them. This did not affect him, however, as independent of some private means of his own, he had money through his wife, so that he had no financial difficulties to contend against or to distress him. Thoroughly imbued with his idea, his wife aided him so far as she was capable of doing. At any rate his word was to her law, his wishes her pleasure to try and anticipate. Up to that time they had been residing in a somewhat small, though compact, house in Kensington, but he complained that it was too small for his work, and after a little delay he discovered a house to his mind at Hampstead. It was a large old-fashioned place, detached, and standing in a considerable area of ground that was shaded with trees of great age. As the house had been untenanted for some time, it was dilapidated and forlorn-looking, while the neglected grounds had run to rank weeds. Dr. Martin and his wife were too much absorbed with their one thought to give any attention to their premises, and so the garden was allowed to remain as it was, and but little was done to improve the external appearance of the house, although a woman was engaged as general servant. In the upper part of the premises were 4 good-sized rooms, and the doctor had these thrown into one large chamber, which he fitted up in a most elaborate manner as a laboratory. In this place he gathered together the most costly chemical apparatus and scientific instruments of all kinds, and then he entirely abandoned himself to the search for that wonderful elixir of life. Of course, Dr. Martin and his partner soon acquired the reputation of being eccentric, and some people even spoke of them as "cracked." The neglected appearance of their house and grounds fostered this idea, and moreover Martin made no secret of what he was bent upon. In fact he proclaimed it to anyone who would listen to him, and at such times his enthusiasm was marvelous. His eyes glowed with kindling light, his face became suffused with a deep flush, his nostrils quivered, and his melodious voice rolled forth a flood of eloquence, until his listeners, falling under his spell of fascination, stared at him in open-mouthed amazement. He did not talk as an empiric or a mountebank. His learning and his wondrous knowledge enabled him to speak with an air of authority. He quoted the most erudite authors in support of his views. His theme was that nature held the secret, if not of perennial youth, at least of prolonging life to a very extreme age, and he was determined to wrest the secret from her. If this was madness, it was certainly a very harmless sort of madness, and calculated to result in good. For be it remembered that up to the time of his daughter's death and his wife's dangerous illness, the doctor had been as other men. He was a philosopher, a scholar, a clever doctor, a humanitarian, and capable of subtle reasoning. He had the faculty of keen observation, and the power of drawing inferences from what he saw. Such a man might have become a monomaniac, but it was a foregone conclusion that the world would be better for anything he might devote his talents to. In his search for the philosopher's stone he was likely to stumble upon something else, that in a practical and utilitarian age would be scarcely less valuable. At any rate this was his own view of the matter. Presently we shall see if he was right. It would be impossible to set forth by mere description the nature of the experiments and the research to which Dr. Martin devoted his days and often part of his nights. His enthusiasm knew no bounds. His perseverance never flagged, his determination could not be daunted, and in his wife he found a patient, willing helpmate, who watched his eyes for her orders and obeyed him by his sign. To this one object his life was now concentrated, and year after year he pursued that object with unflagging zeal. Under such long-continued study, without break, without change, the health of most men would have broken down. But not only was Martin not affected, but to the astonishment of all who knew him, he seemed rather to grow younger than older. His face did not change, his eye lost none of its brightness, his hair showed no signs of grey. People wondered, as was only natural they should, and when some ventured to question him, he answered with a smile of triumph that his labours had not been altogether profitless, and he had discovered a means of preserving the youth, though as yet his secret was not ripe enough for disclosure. When the news of this spread about, as nothing could prevent its doing, numbers of people flocked to Dr. Martin's house, begging of him to give them the means of preserving their youth, and had he been inclined he might have reaped a large fortune. But he despised money. He said he was a servant of science, and that he laboured in the cause of humanity, and when he had thoroughly proved the value of his discovery, he would make it known to the world, but not before. The people were disappointed, but he was firm, and no offer of money, no persuasion, could tempt him. And so for many years Dr. Martin went on in his harmless way, until at last a terrible blow fell upon him, a blow that broke his hopes for a time, and seemed to indicate that his years of labour had been utterly useless. This blow was the death of his devoted wife. She was suddenly seized with apoplexy, and though he called in the assistance of several eminent doctors, they could do nothing. She never rallied, never recovered consciousness, and in 12 hours after the seizure was dead. For the first time Martin's zeal seemed to cool, his energies to desert him, under this heavy affliction. He blamed himself for having allowed his studies to so absorb his attention that he had been blind to his wife's failing health. He vowed that had he not been so blind he could have preserved her life for many years. Her death seemed like a bitter commentary on all that he had been doing, or had done, and of course the world wasn't slow to mock at him. But reverses with such a man only meant fresh stimulus, nor was he likely to be long bowed, however severe the storm that might sweep over his head. His devouring zeal would not permit of that. Inactivity to him would have meant madness or death. And so he once more turned his attention to his favourite pursuits, and displayed utter indifference to the many cruel and spiteful things that were said about him. For 2 or 3 years more, Dr. Martin went on in his old way, forgetting the world, and by the world forgot. He had dropped out of the memory of even his old colleagues, and people who had once been his friends deserted him. It is ever so in this world. A man who elects to pursue a course away from the beaten track must go alone. The pioneer, if he succeeds, is hailed with acclamation, but if he fails he is laughed at, and if he dies on his way the world shrugs its shoulders, says that he shouldn't have attempted such a thing, and then forgets him. But there was one mystery that those who saw Martin could not be altogether indifferent about. Age seemed to bring him none of the physical changes that it brings to all men. Although he was now near 60, he looked little or no older than he did at 40. His energy was as bright, his step as elastic, his hair as dark, his energy as undiminished as ever it was, and it began to be asked whether he had really discovered some antidote against physical decay. Dr. Martin himself was silent on the subject. If he was aware of the curiosity that was thus being revived, he heeded it not. He had his own secrets and knew how to keep them. One day he called upon a colleague of his, but one whom he had not seen for many years. This was Dr. John Brennan, then a man verging on 80 years of age, although he was perfectly hale and hearty. Dr. Brennan was very well known as the author of several medical works, and for nearly 40 years he had been prominently connected with one of the great London hospitals. Brennan was surprised to see his old friend. "I've quite lost sight of you for some years," he said, after the greetings were over. "But, bless my life, you don't seem to have changed a bit. What have you been doing? Have you discovered some magical elixir that is capable of preserving perennial youth?" "Yes," said Martin dryly, "I have." Of course his friend laughed, but Martin proceeded to relate with impressive seriousness the many experiments that he had been so long engaged upon. He declared that he had succeeded in compounding a remarkable chemical substance, which seemed to have the property of retarding the ravages of age, and he drew attention to himself as a living example of the truth of what he said. "But," he exclaimed enthusiastically, "I have done more than that, Brennan. I have discovered a means of suspending animation for practically an unlimited period. It is wonderful, but it is true. A person can be put to sleep for a month, a year, 2 years, any number of years, and at the end of any given period revived again. Need I point out the enormous value of this discovery if it can be clearly demonstrated that it will do what I state? I have reason to believe that during this narcotic sleep, for so it is, all disease, no matter what its nature, would leave the body, and the sleeper would awake with renewed vigor, strength, and health, and consequently with a renewed lease of life. Dr. Brennan smiled incredulously, and seemed disposed to question his friend's sanity. But Martin argued so eloquently, so learnedly, and so convincingly, that at last Brennan asked, "Well, what is it you wish me to do?" "I will tell you. Hitherto my experiments have been carried out upon animals only. Now I intend to submit myself to the experiment, and I want you to form a committee to watch the effects, and to testify to the accuracy of what I say." Brennan seemed reluctant to fall in with this arrangement. In his own mind he thought the thing too ridiculous for serious consideration, and he suggested that a younger man, and one of the new school, should be asked to take the matter up. But Martin urged that his friend's high reputation and great talents were what had induced him to apply to him, for he wanted to place the matter beyond the reach of ridicule or doubt. The result of the interview was that Dr. Brennan consented to think the matter over, and if he saw his way clear to accede to the request, he would then speak to some of his friends, and they would arrange to meet at Martin's house and go into the affair more fully. On this understanding they parted, and a week later Martin received a letter from Brennan to say that he and an old colleague, Dr. Patterson Walker, would call on a certain day at his, Martin's, house. The visit was made, and it is testimony to the eloquence and cleverness of Dr. Martin that he was enabled to carry something like conviction to the minds of these staid, scientific men, for they consented to organize a committee and investigate Martin's alleged discovery. Dr. Martin stipulated that he was not to disclose his secret until after the experiment. This was somewhat unwillingly agreed to, and all the necessary arrangements having been made, and a committee of 8 well-known medical men, including Brennan and Walker, having been formed, a day was fixed for the commencement of the experiment. Dr. Martin first of all signed a paper, in which he declared that what he was about to do was done in the interests of science and the cause of suffering humanity, and that it was of his own free will and at his earnest desire that the experiment was to be carried out. This document having been duly attested by every one of the gentlemen present, Dr. Martin produced 2 phials. One contained 4 ounces of a perfectly colorless viscid fluid, not unlike glycerin in consistency. The other contained about 2 ounces of a bright amber, limpid fluid. The doctor explained that he would swallow the white fluid, and that within half an hour afterwards he would sink into a profound sleep, that gradually all the functions would cease, or seem to cease, the face would assume a waxen pallor, and the respiration would be imperceptible. In this condition he might be kept for an indefinite period, but 3 months was fixed as the limit in this case. At the end of that time, the inside of the mouth and tongue were to be wetted with a feather dipped in the amber fluid. This would gradually cause the breathing to recommence. Then the fluid was to be poured down the throat drop by drop until it was all swallowed, and full animation had returned. A bedroom had been prepared with a bed specially arranged, and when Dr. Martin had suitably attired himself, he lay down on the bed and drank the white liquid. As he had predicted, he fell into a deep sleep, and a little later he had all the appearance of a corpse, save that there was a slight warmth about the body and a faint flush on the face. This condition lasted for a week without any change, and the watchers began to think that Martin had really discovered the means of suspending animation and restoring it again. Another week passed, and the only noticeable change then was that the face had become more waxen, and the most delicate tests failed to detect either the breathing or warmth in the body. But the committee felt no alarm, for there were signs that were not compatible with death, and their excitement and interest increased as it seemed probable that the experiment would be successful. 2 months passed, and the same condition was maintained, to the amazement of the committee. It was then decided as a test to make a small puncture in the arm. This was done, and blood flowed, incontestably proving that the man was alive. As the time for reawakening him approached, the excitement was intense, and it was felt that a tremendous triumph was in store for science, and that the name of this extraordinary little man, who had devoted 20 years to perfecting his discovery, would be immortalized. At length the day for the awakening came, and in addition to the original committee, 2 eminent scientists and 2 other doctors requested to be present, their request being granted. When all was ready, the amber fluid was applied as Martin had directed, and its effect was watched with breathless anxiety and eagerness. Sure enough, the breathing became perceptible, and the fluid was poured down the throat and swallowed. Then those standing round noticed, not without alarm, that the waxen pallor of the face gave place to a dirty greyish hue, that deepened to brown, and gradually changed to mahogany colour. What did this mean? Surely something was wrong. No warmth could be detected in the body, and the breathing was no longer perceptible. But now a more astounding change took place. The hair gradually blanched until it was white, the eyes fell in, and an extraordinary appearance of age came into the face. It was drawn and puckered, with the bones showing through the brown skin until it looked for all the world like the wizened face of a sick monkey. The spectators were appalled, and frantic efforts were made to restore animation. But all was useless, and one and all shrank back in loathing and horror, for on the bed before them was a withered and decayed corpse, so decayed that on someone touching one of the hands the bones of the fingers broke away. When the onlookers had recovered from the shock this wonderful and startling change had produced upon them, they proceeded to examine the body. That Martin was dead was beyond all doubt, and his body had all the appearance of a corpse many weeks old. The odour from it was unbearable, and all the flesh had assumed a mummified appearance. This ghastly ending to the experiment was a great blow to those who had consented to watch it. But what was the mystery? For mystery there most certainly was. For 3 months Martin had lain on the bed like a waxen image, without the slightest sign of decay or change of any kind. But as soon as the revivifying elixir was applied, the appalling transformation commenced. But the most incomprehensible part of the mystery was that breathing was detected at first, and the fluid was actually swallowed. But then, within an incredibly short space of time, all the conditions of old age set in, followed by putridity and decay. No man there, and yet they were all men of extreme cleverness, could offer a word of explanation. They had seen with their own eyes and were ready to swear on oath to the facts I have narrated, but they could not account for them. Dr. Martin, after 20 years of study, had succeeded in giving his fellow men a problem which has never been solved and is never likely to be. And the secret of his wonderful elixirs, by which he had really preserved his youth and for 3 months had prevented his body from decaying, was lost with him. End of Story 22, The Stranger Story of Dr. Martin. End of Stories Weird and Wonderful by J. E. Muddock.